right? Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the cost of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And it's the students of today who are going to be paying for the profligacy that we've integrated into our lives and our economic system. We are borrowing today in this country $1 billion a day just to pay for the oil that we're importing from the Mideast and other countries. It's an expense. Even this war in Iraq is going to cost us, according to GAO now, $1.4 trillion. That for nothing. We've got nothing from it. That the next generation is going to pay. The students here are going to spend a good part of their working life trying to pay back the debts that we're running up today. And it is a concern because they could have other choices to use that money, but they're going to be paying for something that we don't need. And we have, and the good news is we have the technological, we have the scientific capacity to completely wean ourselves from oil, at least as a generator of electricity. We need to figure out the fuel issue, and that's also easy to figure out. But within a few years, we can completely wean ourselves of carbon as an electrical source in this country. It's not a technical problem. It's not a science problem. It's a political problem. It's a problem of political will, and because of that, students, particularly, and people of that age group, need to get involved in the political process and start demanding that their concerns be taken into account. And we're not protecting the environment for the sake of the fishes and the birds. We're protecting it because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities. And that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities for our children, to provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, the shared resources of our society, the commonwealth, the landscapes that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source ultimately of our values and our virtues and our character as a people. And I'm going to talk about that and the relationship to the economy and the environment, how the two are absolutely intertwined and inseparable. But also, I want to talk about kind of one of the broader issues, which is the corrosive impact of excessive corporate power on a democracy, and particularly on American democracy. And I want to start by saying this. I've been nonpartisan, I've been disciplined about being nonpartisan and bipartisan in my approach to these issues for 25 years as an environmental advocate. I don't think there's any such thing as Republican children or Democratic children. I think the worst thing that can happen to the environment is if it becomes the province of a single political party. But you can't talk honestly. I support Republican candidates and Democratic candidates in every election cycle if they've got a good track record on these issues. And somebody accused me because I wrote a book that was very critical of President Bush. It was a bestseller called Crimes Against Nature. And now I'm writing a partisan book, but the book is not partisan. It just tells the truth. I didn't write that book because I'm a Democrat and he's a Republican, and I want to go out and bash Republicans. If he had been a Democrat, I'd written the same book. It's not partisanship to tell the truth or to criticize somebody of another party, as long as you're not doing it just because they're a member of the other party. It's just honesty, and it's what we're all supposed to be doing, especially criticizing our government. That's our patriotic duty. But you can't talk honestly about the environment in any context today without speaking critically of this president. This is the worst environmental administration that we've ever had in American history, bar none. If you look at NRDC's website, the Natural Resource Defense Council, which is one of the groups for which I work, you'll see listed there over 400 major environmental rollbacks that have been promoted or implemented by this White House over the past 7 years as part of a deliberate, concerted effort to eviscerate 30 years of environmental law. It's a stealth attack. The White House has used all kinds of ingenious machinations to conceal its radical agenda from the American public, including Orwellian rhetoric. When they want to destroy the forest, they call it the Healthy Forest Act. When they want to destroy the air, they call it the Clear Skies Bill. But most insidiously, they have put polluters in charge of virtually all the agencies of government that are supposed to be protecting Americans from pollution. The head of the Forest Service is a timber industry lobbyist, Mark Gray. The head of public lands, President Bush appointed a mining industry lobbyist, Stephen J. Griles, who believes that public lands are unconstitutional. And he just started a 10-month jail sentence for these sweetheart deals that he was doing with the oil and mining companies. As head of Air Division at EPA, a utility lobbyist, Jeffre who's represented during his previous career nothing but the worst air polluters, utility air polluters. As head of Superfund, a woman whose last job was teaching corporate polluters how to evade Superfund. As second in command of EPA, a Monsanto lobbyist. I did a piece for Vanity Fair magazine last spring, where I went through the top 100 environmental officials of this administration, and virtually all of them are, in the Department of Commerce, which regulates fisheries, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy, the FDA, of course the EPA, the Department of Interior, and even the relevant division of the Justice Department. Virtually all of them are lobbyists or representatives of the worst of the worst of the worst polluters. In all of these polluting areas, there are certain industries that are just polluting, like the oil industry and the coal industry and utilities. But within each of those categories, there are good guys and bad guys. And these people that they've chosen tend to come from the bottom feeders, the worst of the worst of the worst actors within each of those communities. And the president's chief environmental advisor, the New York Times just did a series on this guy, Philip Cooney. He's the chief of staff of the Council on Environmental Quality, which is in the White House with offices next to the Oval Office. And his job, purportedly, is to advise the president on the environmental impacts of every decision he makes. Well, Philip Cooney's last job was as chief lobbyist for the American Petroleum Institute. And as it turns out, his principal preoccupation over the past 7 years has been combing through every federal scientific document issued by all the different agencies of government and redacting or removing or suppressing inculpatory statements or damaging statements about the oil industry or the coal industry. So, he's not a scientist, he's a lobbyist. But he's been altering scientific documents for the benefit of big polluters. So his job has been, there's no nicer way to put this, to lie to the American public. And there's nothing wrong with having business people in government. It's a good thing if your objective is to recruit competence and expertise. But in all of these situations, these particular individuals have entered government service not to serve the public interest, but rather to subvert the very laws that they're now charged with enforcing in order to enrich the president's corporate paymasters. And they have imposed tremendous diminution in quality of life on the people of this country. Most Americans don't know about it. They don't make the connections because we have a negligent and indolent press in this country that is simply representing American economy. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's something that anybody who cares about our democracy has to be aware of. That when people talk, I saw Bill O'Reilly last night. I was watching him, and he was talking about the liberal media. And this is what you hear again, the liberal media. But there's no such thing as the liberal media in this country. There is that's what Joseph Goebbels used to call the big lie. If you keep saying it again and again and again, there's a liberal media out there and there's a liberal elite, then all of a sudden it becomes true and people believe it. But there's no liberal media. There's a right-wing media in this country, and disproportionately that's where Americans are getting their news. The Pew Foundation just did a survey that showed that 30% of Americans now say their primary news source is talk radio, which is 90% controlled by the right. 22% say cable news, mainly Fox News, which of course is right-wing, 10% said Sinclair Network, which is the largest television network in America, and it's controlled, and it's the most right-wing of all of them, it's controlled by a former pornographer who requires all 75 of his local affiliate stations to take a pledge that they will not report critically about this president, about the war in Iraq, or a number of other issues. And then the rest of us are getting our news. Only 11% of Americans now read newspapers regularly. The rest of us are getting our news from the traditional corporate media, ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN, which have no ideology except for their own pocketbooks. And that ideology invariably is coterminous with the ideology of government and power, and particularly the Republican Party, which is, you know, encouraging all these kind of consolidations that they are so fond of, and that they're making so much money. And they all have hundreds of subsidiaries that are doing business with the government, and they're not going to say something that is going to alienate or, you know, is going to put them on the wrong side in disfavor with public officials. But generally speaking, well, the decline of the American media, the devolution of the American media, began in 1988 when Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine. We had a law in this country that was passed in 1928, which became known as the Fairness Doctrine, that regulated, that basically said, Fairness Doctrine, this is the dawn of commercial radio. The Fairness Doctrine said that the airwaves belong to the public. If you own a newspaper, you can publish anything you want. But if you're using the airwaves, they belong to us. And you have to use them to promote the, quote, promote the public interest and to advance American democracy. There were three requirements under the Fairness Doctrine. Number one, they had to air news of public import. That does not mean Anna Nicole Smith or Lindsay Lohan. It means issues that are critical for us making rational decisions in a democracy. That's why there's a 6 o'clock news hour on all the networks. The networks didn't want to put a 6 o'clock news hour in that prime time. They wanted to put entertainment there. The news divisions were chronic money losers. They want to put entertainment in that slot, which is now what they're doing. And you know, that's why the radio stations periodically update you on the news, even the music stations, because those are all artifacts of the requirements under the Fairness Doctrine. Number two, if they were going to give opinion, they had to tell both sides. You couldn't have had a Fox News under the Fairness Doctrine. You couldn't have had a Rush Limbaugh, okay? And Rush Limbaugh got started in 1988 because Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine. And you could have had Rush for 4 hours, but then you would have had to put a countervailing voice for 4 hours. You couldn't have Rush and his ditto heads for 24 hours a day on the same station. The third requirement was that they avoid corporate consolidation, that there be local control and diversity of control. That requirement was strengthened in 1946 by Congress because they saw what Hitler had done in Europe and the other fascist governments of Europe had done during World War II, where they had used media consolidations and licensing deals to basically to control the media and to muzzle criticism of their administrations and their power grab. And Congress said, we can't let that happen here. We have to have local control, diversity of control. We want to make sure there's lots and lots of companies out there that are going to keep an eye on each other and compete to bring the news to the American public. We want to make sure that people in, you know, in Kansas can get crop reports, that people in North Dakota can get tornado warnings, that people in the South can get country music, and that you're not going to have programming and content dictated by a couple of corporate epicenters in remote parts of the country. Well, Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine in 1988 as a favor to the Christian right, which was already plotting to take over of AM radio, and as a favor to the big studio heads who had helped him get elected, who were plotting to take over of all media. And today, as a result of that, there are 5 giant multinational corporations that control all 14,000 radio stations in America, all 2,200 television stations in our country, 80% of our newspapers, all of our billboards, and most of the large internet content providers. So there's 5 guys who are deciding what Americans hear as news. And they no longer have an obligation to serve the public interest. Their only obligation now is to their shareholders. So how do they serve that? First of all, by cutting costs. So they got rid of their investigative reporters, the people who can make the connections between the money that the president took and the mercury rules he rolled back, and the fact that you can't fish anymore in this country because all the fish are contaminated with mercury. Or the connection when somebody sees everybody knows an asthmatic kid. Well, most asthma attacks are caused by the bad air that was supposed to be eliminated in the Clean Air Act, but it wasn't because the money that was received by the president. And people don't make that connection because the investigative reporters who were going to connect those dots are gone. 80% of them have lost their jobs over the past 15 years. They also got rid of their foreign news bureaus. And when I was a boy, ABC alone had 47 news bureaus in Europe. Today they have none. They buy news in a can. And that's why we're supposed to be, if you want to get into foreign news in this country, you got to go to BBC. And we're supposed to be the leaders of the free world, but we have no clue what's happening in the free world or anywhere in the world. And that's why we accepted in this country this neocon fantasy that we were going to be welcomed by flowers and rose petals in the streets when we wandered into a 1,800-year-old fist fight in Iraq. In Europe, they didn't believe it in Canada because they're still getting real news in those countries. But we're getting this ginned up stuff from Fox and CNN, and it's just this false patriotism. And support the president at any cost, and the White House press corps is just a karaoke group for and they're all reading off of White House press sheets, and there's none of the things that function that press is supposed to play, which is to criticize power and speak truth to power. And they don't do that anymore in our country because they're scared of getting denied their little seat at those White House press conferences, which are just propaganda meetings. And because they don't have an obligation to serve the public interest, their only obligation is their shareholders, they want to expand viewership, which brings in more ad revenue. Well, how do you do that? Not by telling us, the difficult, complicated issues about, what happens, what really happens when you privatize Social Security, and who on Wall Street gets rich when you do that. What really happens when you turn Medicaid over to the pharmaceutical companies. What really happens, with global warming, and all these really complicated issues that we really, really need to understand when we go to the voting, because nobody understands them because the press isn't explaining them to us. Instead, they're entertaining us. They're appealing to the lowest common denominator, the prurient interest that all of us have in the reptilian cores of our brain for sex and celebrity gossip. And Nicole Smith and Britney Spears and Brad and Jen and Brad and J-Lo and Brad and Kate and we know more about Lindsay Lohan than we do about global warming. And Americans today are the best entertained and the least informed people on the face of the earth. And that is that's a terrible danger in a democracy, because you can't have democracy for very long if you don't have an informed public. And this is what, Jefferson said that. Jefferson said, an uninformed public will trade 100 years of hard-fought civil rights for a half an hour of welfare. The first demagogue or tyrant or religious fanatic who comes along and promises them a $300 tax break that they'll tear up the Bill of Rights. He didn't say that second part, but this is what he did. At the time, Jefferson, who was the biggest multi-Democrat of all of them, was fighting with Hamilton Madison Adams because Jefferson wanted the universal franchise. And Hamilton Madison Adams said, no, only the landed gentry should be permitted to vote. And it wasn't because they were snobs or less democratic than he was. It was because they believed that only the landed gentry had the fortitude and the sophistication to understand the long-term value of holding on to the Bill of Rights. And that the uneducated mob would quickly follow a tyrant and tear up the Bill of Rights and power with the tyrants. And and it was only the landed gentry who would fight to preserve those Bill of Rights. And Jefferson agreed with them, and he said, you're right, the uninformed public cannot be trusted, but the remedy for that is not to deprive the public of their rights, but rather forcibly inform them, whether they want to be informed or not. And that's why the first 13 colonies did something nobody had ever done in history, which was to mandate public education, so that you could go to jail if you didn't educate your children and if you didn't educate yourself, because if you were uneducated and uninformed, you were regarded as a threat to American democracy and to the rest of us, to the whole community. So they did something, Massachusetts had first mandatory public education. And Virginia, Jefferson started the University of Virginia, these educational institutes in all the counties of Virginia to make sure that the public had access and had an education, whether they wanted to be educated or not. And then when the Fairness Doctrine came along, Congress said, this is going to be the way that the public gets its information. We can't allow it to fall into the hands of a few corporations who are then going to manipulate public attitudes for their own profits and make sweetheart deals with government officials that will keep them in power and, will stop people from asking questions about their democracy. So we have to make sure that it's owned by a whole lot of people, and there's a competition to get information out, and we have to mandate that they educate the public about important issues, whether the public wants to be educated or not. And so they licensed broadcasters to use them. They said you can make a profit, but your primary obligation has to be to educate the public about issues that are critical in our democracy. And and that's not happening anymore. And I've encountered this for many years. I've been doing public speaking to groups on the environment for 20 years. When people were saying, the environment is a non-issue with the public, but I'd go and speak to people, and particularly since the Bush administration, before that, Gingrich was, in the same kind of mischief, and I would talk to Republican groups. I do about 20 or 30 speeches a year to Republican groups and red state audiences. I get the same reaction that I get from the liberal college group, strong, enthusiastic reactions. And I came to the conclusion a long time ago that the values are the same. There's no such thing as red state values and blue state values. The values are the same. Americans share the same aspirations for our country. The only thing is an information deficit. That, I was thinking this for many years, like 80% of Republicans are just Democrats who don't know what's going on. But they're not getting the news. Actually, my anecdotal observation of that phenomenon were confirmed in 2004 by a national survey called a comprehensive national survey called the Piper Report by the Public Policy Institute of the University of Maryland. They went out and they surveyed people based upon their knowledge of current events and their party affiliation. And what they found was that there was a huge deficit between Republicans and Democrats about their knowledge of current events. 70% of the people who said that they were going to vote for George Bush said that they believed that Saddam Hussein had bombed the World Trade Center. 70% said that they believed that weapons of mass destruction had been found in Iraq. 65% said that they believed that President Bush strongly supported the Kyoto Protocol and strong labor and environmental standards in our international treaties. 70% said that they believed the American invasion of Iraq was strongly supported by our traditional allies in Europe and by Iraq's Muslim neighbors, both of which were untrue. They went back twice. People went back twice to the same people. The second time, they went back and asked the people what their news source was, and what they found was that the people who had this misinformation invariably said that their principal news source was Fox News or talk radio. Then they went back a third time to find out what people's real values were. And they did this by posing a series of hypotheticals where, for example, they said, what if there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? What if Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with bombing the World Trade Center? What if the American invasion was largely opposed on the Muslim street and among our traditional allies, should we have still gone in? 80% of Democrats, 80% of Republicans said the same thing. We should not. So the values were the same. It was just the information that made the difference. And that's why it's so important to have a strong press in our nation, in a democracy, because people will come to the correct conclusions. But without that press, without the information, they're easily misled. And you know, I got off the subject here that I intended to talk about, but this whole speech has turned into a digression now. Let me try to get back, circle back, and talk. You know, I talked about that in my realm where I work with the environment, about this disconnect between public policy and or about public perception and reality. And I'll talk about it just in terms of one industry, which is coal burning power plants, which are a huge issue in this part of the United States for a variety of reasons. But it's an issue all over the United States. In my book, I talk about all these different industries that have a chokehold on this administration. Corporate hog farms, industrial agriculture, the chemical industry, the nuclear industry. I'll talk just tonight about one industry, it's coal burning power plants. I have 3 sons who have asthma. 1 out of every 4 black children in America's cities now have asthma, and 1 out of every 8 children born in this country today have asthma. We have a pediatric asthma epidemic. We don't know really the cause of it. We have suspicions. We don't know the cause of it. But we do know that asthma attacks, the attacks themselves, are triggered primarily by bad air, by ozone and particulates. The principal source of those materials in our atmosphere are 400 coal-burning power plants that are burning coal illegally. It's been illegal for 18 years under the Clean Air Act. And many of the plants did clean up. Coincidentally, most of them, like in Massachusetts, all of them removed, installed scrubbers under stack to remove those materials. And generally speaking, in the blue states, they comply with the law. In the red states, where corporations can easily dominate the state political landscapes, they weren't required to. And so 400 of them were not doing it. The Clinton administration was prosecuting the worst 52 of those plants criminally and civilly for violating the law. But this is an industry that donated $156 million to President Bush and his party since the 2000 cycle. And one of the first things that President Bush did when he achieved office was to order the Justice Department and the EPA to drop all those lawsuits. The top 3 enforcers at EPA, Bruce Buckheit, Sylvia Lawrence, and Eric Jeffre, all resigned their jobs in protest. These were not Democrats. These were people who had worked through the Reagan administration and the Bush administration, previous Bush administration. The top Justice Department attorney said that this had never happened before in American history, where a presidential candidate accepts money from criminals under indictment, then orders those cases dropped when he achieves office. Immediately after doing that, the White House abolished the new source rule, which was the heart and soul of the Clean Air Act, the most important provision in that statute. That's the rule, the new source rule, that required those plants to clean up 18 years ago. So now there's no requirement that they ever have to clean up the ozone and particulates. And all of those plants in Massachusetts and elsewhere that invested in these new technologies are now at a profound disadvantage in the marketplace. And I'm going to be able to watch my children gasping for air on bad air days because somebody gave money to a politician. And if you go to EPA's website tonight when you go home, not NRDC's website, but federal EPA, you'll see that single decision alone by President Bush to abolish the new source rule kills 18,000 Americans every year. 6 times the number of people who were killed in the World Trade Center attacks, but not just once. Year after year after year after year. This should be the front page headline of every newspaper in this country every day. But you will not read about it in the American press. You'll read about it in the European press, in the Canadian press, but not in the American press. About 36 months ago, the federal EPA announced that in 19 states, it's now unsafe to eat any freshwater fish caught in the state. And I believe Kentucky is one of those states. because of mercury contamination. In 49 states, at least some of the fish are unsafe to eat. In fact, and the mercury is coming from those same coal-burning power plants. In fact, the only state where all the fish are still safe to eat is Dick Cheney's home state of Wyoming, where the Republican-controlled legislature has refused to appropriate the money to test the fish. But in all the other states, at least some, most, or all of the fish is now unsafe to eat. We know a lot about mercury, a couple decades ago. We know, for example, that according to CDC, 1 out of every 6 American women now has so much mercury in her womb that her children are at risk for a grim inventory of diseases: autism, blindness, mental retardation, heart, liver, and kidney disease, among many others. I have so much mercury in my body just from eating fish and I got my levels tested recently. And every woman should have her levels tested of childbearing years. Everybody should, because it's also associated with early onset Alzheimer's and memory loss, and it's a very, very potent brain toxin. And you can get your levels tested by going to our website, Waterkeeper Alliance, and send us a little lock of your hair, and we'll send you back your mercury levels. But my levels were 2.5 times what EPA considers safe. And particularly, you should get tested if you ever eat sushi, or if you ever eat tuna fish. My levels, anyway, were 2.5 times what EPA considers safe. I was told by Dr. David Carpenter, who's the National Authority on Mercury Contamination, that a woman with my levels of mercury in her blood would have children with cognitive impairment, permanent brain damage. I said to him, "You mean she might have?" And he said, "No, the science is very certain. Her children would have some level of permanent brain injury. Probably at my levels, an IQ loss in those kids, permanent IQ loss of about 5 to 7 points." Well, today, according to CDC, there are 640,000 children born in this country every year who've been exposed to dangerous levels of mercury in their mother's wombs. The Clinton administration, recognizing the gravity of this national health epidemic, reclassified mercury as a hazardous pollutant under the Clean Air Act. That triggered a requirement that all of those plants remove 90% of the mercury within 3.5 years. It would have cost them less than 1% of plant revenues. And guess what? We know that it works. When they remove the mercury from the stacks, within 5 years, it disappears from the fish and the waterways downstream. So, it was a great deal for the American people, but still billions of dollars for that industry, and that's the industry that donated $156 million to this White House. And about 18 months ago, the White House announced that it was scrapping the Clinton-era rules and substituting instead rules that were written by utility industry lobbyists that will require the industry to never have to clean up the mercury. The new rules, incidentally, as I said, they were not written as was the practice for 100 years by government officials, but private lawyers from the law firm of Latham and Watkins, which is a good law firm that does a lot of good stuff, but traditionally it was previously a lobbying firm for the worst of the worst of the worst of these utilities companies, like the Southern Company, which is just a criminal enterprise, and which was the major beneficiary of these new mercury rules, because they discharged the second most mercury of any utility in the country. The chief lobbyist for that law firm was a man named Jeffre for the Southern Company. And President Bush tapped him to become the head of the Air Division at EPA. And Homestead just took rules that he had written as a private attorney for his clients and made them American law, and saved billions of dollars for his cronies at Latham and Watkins, and for the utilities by imposing tens of billions of dollars of costs on the rest of us. And just to finish the story, 2 days after they completed the promulgation of those rules, we sued them to try to stop them, and we delayed them for a couple of years. But finally, they achieved it. And 2 days after they achieved it, Homestead, 2 top deputies at EPA, who were former Southern Company lobbyists, went back to work for Southern Company, 2 days. And Homestead himself, in October, went back, left EPA to go work for Bracewell Giuliani, which is Giuliani's new Texas-based lobbying firm, which today is the primary lobbying firm of the Southern Company. And so this is this kind of revolving door of plunder that occurs when you put corporations in charge of a democracy. And I didn't tell you this at the outset, but Philip Cooney, after the Times did a series of stories on him. He's the president's chief environmental advisor. He was the former lobbyist for the American Petroleum Institute. After the Times story aired, he was forced to leave the White House. And 2 days later, he went back to work for Exxon Corporation. And in fact, he never stopped working for Exxon. It's just that we were paying him for 7 years. But he was still working, and that's how it works. Today we're living in a science fiction nightmare in our country, where my children and the children of most Americans, including all the children of Kentucky, can now no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing with their father and mother in the local fishing hole and then come home and safely eat the fish, because somebody gave money to a politician. I live 2 hours south of the Adirondack Mountains. I take my kids fishing, hunting, swimming, hiking, kayaking. I was camping there a few weeks ago, winter camping. This is the oldest protected wilderness on the face of the earth. It's been protected as forever wild since 1885. We had a right to believe, the American people, that generations of our citizens would be able to enjoy those landscapes unspoiled. Today, 1/5 of the lakes in the Adirondacks is sterilized from acid rain. No life in it at all. Which is coming from the same coal burning power plants, and which has also destroyed the forest cover on the high peaks of the Appalachians from Georgia all the way up to northern Quebec. And this president, having accepted $156 million from that industry, has put the brakes on the statutory requirements, and they clean up the acid rain. And as a direct result of those rollbacks, this year, a few months ago, the EPA announced that for the first time in the 30-year history of the Clean Air Act, the levels of sulfur dioxide have actually gone up in America's air, an astronomical 4% in a single year. A few months ago, I tried a case I had a 6-week jury trial down in Clarksburg, West Virginia, which we won the largest judgment in the history of the state. It was affirmed by the appellate court yesterday, $400 million judgment against a big company that was polluting there. While I was there, I spent a lot of time flying over the Cumberland and West Virginia, and as I've done over the past 5 years on many occasions, and I saw something that if the American people could see it, there would be a revolution in this country. We are cutting down the Appalachian Mountains, literally. These historic landscapes where Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett roamed, that are so much a part of America's culture, and so rooted in those landscapes. The Appalachians are it's the oldest forest in North America. It's the Pleistocene Ice Age. My home in New York, where it was under 2.5 miles of ice. And the rest of North America became a tundra. The forest disappeared, except in one small refugium they call it, which was in the Appalachian Mountains. That's the only place the forest survived. And then when the glaciers withdrew, the forest all receded from that mother forest in the Appalachians. So, all the forests in North America are the descendants of the seed stock from that forest. It's their mother forest. And now we're doing something, these coal companies, Massey Coal, Community Coal, Arch Coal, are doing something that the glaciers couldn't do, which is flattening the landscapes and then destroying those forests. And they're doing it with these giant machines called drag lines that are 22 stories high. I flew under one of them in a Piper Cup. It cost $500 million, and they practically dispensed with the need for human labor, which indeed is the point. When my father was fighting strip mining in Appalachia back in the 60s, I remember a conversation I had with him when I was 14 years old, where he said to me, they're not just destroying the environment, they're permanently impoverishing these communities, because there's no way that they can regenerate an economy from these barren landscapes that are left behind. And he said they're doing it so they can break the unions. And that's exactly what they did. When he told me that, there were 140,000 unionized mine workers in West Virginia digging coal out of tunnels in the ground. Today, there are fewer than 11,000 miners left in the state, and almost none of them are unionized because the strip industry isn't. And they're taking more coal out of West Virginia every year than they were in 1968. The only difference is, back then, at least some of that money was being left in the state for pensions and salaries and reinvestment in those communities. Today, virtually all of it goes straight up to Wall Street, to the corporate offices of Massey Coal, Peabody Coal, Arch Coal, and the big banking house like Morgan Stanley, which own these operations. 95% of the coal in West Virginia is owned by out-of-state operations. And using these huge machines and 2,500 tons of dynamite that they explode every day in West Virginia, it's the equivalent of a Hiroshima bomb every week. They're blowing the tops off the mountains to get at the coal seams beneath. And they use these big machines to scrape rock and debris and rubble into the adjacent river valley, and they bury the river, they bury the hollow, they flatten the landscape. According to EPA, they've already buried 2,200 miles of America's rivers and streams, never to be seen again. And by the time this president is finished, they'll have flattened an area of the Appalachian the size of Delaware. They've blown up 460 of the biggest mountains in West Virginia. You can go to Google Earth, actually to the homepage, and you can see, you put in your zip code, and you can see the mountain that was blown up to heat your house. You know, and it's just, and you can look down on it, it's through satellite photos. They're just big holes in the ground. Some of these holes are 200 square miles. You know, some of these big open pits. And of course, nothing ever grows there again except for this, you know, this crap grass, because they don't do what the law requires, because all the agencies are captive. So, and it's all illegal. You cannot in the United States take rock and debris and rubble and dump it into a waterway without a Clean Water Act permit, and you can never get a permit to do such a thing. So we sued them. And we won the lawsuit in front of a conservative Republican federal judge, Judge Charles Hayden, in West Virginia, who said the same thing I said. He said it's all illegal, it's been illegal since day one, and he enjoined all mountaintop mining and put an end to it. 2 days from when we got that decision, lobbyists for Peabody Coal and Massey Coal met in the back door of the Interior Department with Gail Norton's first deputy chief, Stephen J. Griles, who was a former lobbyist for Massey Coal and Peabody Coal. And together they rewrote the interpretation for one word of the Clean Water Act, the definition of the word fill, to change 30 years of statutory interpretation and effectively overrule Judge Hayden's decision and make it legal today, not just in West Virginia, but in Kentucky, Ohio, and every state in the United States, to dump rock, debris, rubble, garbage, solid waste, any solid material into any waterway in the United States without a Clean Water Act permit. All you need today is a rubber stamp permit from the Corps of Engineers, which in some districts you can get over the telephone or through the mail. And so this is, you know, what we are facing today. It's not just the destruction of our environment, it's the subversion of American democracy. And you know, the big polluters and their indentured servants in our political process and their phony think tanks on Capitol Hill like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, which pretend to like free markets, but they hate free markets. What they really their function is just to justify corporate profit-taking at any cost. And they're slick PR firms like First and Marstella and Edelman and all these other, you know, sleazy outfits, and they're phony scientists that they house in these think tanks. They're tobacco scientists, we call them biostitutes. And, you know, we're saying and all this stuff. They've been very adept over the past 20 years at marginalizing environmentalists as tree huggers or radicals or, you know, or as I heard the other day, or militants, or as I heard the other day, pagans who worship trees and sacrifice people. But there's nothing radical about the idea of clean air and clean water for our children. And we are not protecting the environment, as I said before, for the sake of the fishes and the birds, but because we understand that it's the infrastructure of our communities. And if you talk to these people on Capitol Hill who are promoting these kind of rollbacks and say, orchestrating them, and say to them, you know, why are you doing this? You have children too. What they invariably say is, well, the time has come in our nation's history where we have to choose now between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, in 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our communities. If, on the other hand, we want to do what they've been urging us to do on Capitol Hill, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, but our children are going to pay for our joyride. And they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they're never going to be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending, as I said before. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And one of the things that I've done over the past 2 decades is to constantly go around and confirm this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications and road construction. It's an investment we have to make if we're going to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and the next generation. And I want to say this. There is no stronger advocate for free market capitalism than myself. I believe the free market is the most efficient and democratic way to distribute the goods of the land. That the best thing that could happen to the environment is if we had true free market capitalism in this country, because the free market promotes efficiency, and efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. And the free market would encourage us to properly value our natural resources. And it's the undervaluation of those resources that causes us to use them wastefully. But in a true free market economy, we do not have a free market in this country. You know, all the major sectors, agriculture and energy, particularly, are completely driven by subsidies and by sweetheart deals and by monopoly control and vertical integration. And there's total market failure. It's called market failure. It has nothing to do with free markets. And the job of government is to establish rules in the marketplace that reward good behavior, which means efficiency and things that are good for our community, and punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency-based and externalizing costs. And the government isn't doing that, so the market is run rampant. And it's you know, instead the government's passing out $1 trillion a year in subsidies to our oil companies, you know, which of course, you know, give them a huge advantage in the marketplace. If they were paying the true cost of doing business, and we were paying at the pump, gasoline would be costing us $10 a gallon. And we'd be definitely screaming at Detroit to make cars that got 40 miles per gallon. The marketplace would start working because rational signals would be sent. It distorts the whole marketplace when you give these subsidies. And the whole market today is based on massive subsidies that are almost unimaginable. And you know, in a true free market economy, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. You know, when the Southern Company, corporations are externalizing machines. They're constantly devising ways to get somebody else to pay their cost of production. And if you're in a polluting industry, the most obvious way to do that is to shift your cleanup cost to the public. Make yourself a billionaire by poisoning the rest of us. You know, and when the Southern Company puts mercury up through a stack in the state of Mississippi, and that falls on New York State, and it poisons our children's brains, and it makes it so I can't fish in the state anymore. I pay $30 for a fishing license every year. And the Constitution of the state, like the Constitution of Kentucky and Ohio, say the people of the state own the waterways of the state, and we own the fisheries. They're not owned by the governor or by the legislature. They're certainly not owned by the Southern Company. But today they are, because we can't use them anymore. They've privatized a public trust resource. And you know, this is ancient law, by the way. It goes back to Roman times. It's in the Code of Justinian. It's in the Magna Carta. I'll just give you a quick history lesson. in the Roman law, 2,000 years ago, was the Code of Justinian. It said that those things that are not susceptible to private ownership, but by their nature are the commonwealth, the property of the public, and it enumerated them in the Code of Justinian. You can look this up on the Google, as President Bush calls it. The air, the water, the wildlife, fisheries, the public lands, the aquifers, the dune lands, the beach lands. This is all in Roman law. And public forests, they had those even in those days. They said those belong to the public. If you're a citizen of Rome, whether you're rich or poor, humble or noble, African or European, you have an absolute right to cross a beach and throw in a net and take out your share of the fish. The emperor himself couldn't stop you. But then Roman law broke down in Europe during the Dark Ages. And the local lords, this is what always one of the first acts in a tyranny, are efforts by powerful private entities within a society to privatize public trust resources. And in Europe, what happened is in every jurisdiction, the local kings, the feudal lords, began reasserting control over the public trust resource. For example, in England, King John said, the public no longer owns the deer, which used to be an important food source for the poor. And he said only nobility from now on can hunt the deer. And that's what got him in trouble with Robin Hood. He also erected navigational barriers on the Thames and the other rivers of England, so you had to pay to go up and down the river, something they had never seen before. And he began selling monopolies to the fisheries. So instead of the public owning the fish and being the social safety net, if you were starving, you could go catch a fish. Now the fish were owned by wealthy people who could sell it to the public at a profit. And the public was so outraged by these changes that this theft of public trust resources, that they rose up and they confronted him at the Battle of Runnymede, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which was the beginning of constitutional democracy on our planet. And the Magna Carta has all of our Bill of Rights, the Bethlehem for the American Bill of Rights, including ones we don't have anymore, like habeas corpus. But it also had additional chapters on free access to fisheries and navigable waters. And those rights descended to the states and, and the air. In England, in the 16th century, there was a Clean Air Act in London that made it a capital crime to burn coal in the city of London, and people were executed for it. So when the polluters get up and say, these new laws were invented by, crazy wingnut environmentalists in the 1970s, that's not true. We always had these laws. We always had a right to clean air and clean water. And what the polluters are doing is they're privatizing something that belongs to us and turning it into cash for them. And they privatize the fish. The southern companies privatize all the fish in New York State. And they privatize the air in my children's lungs because my kids can't breathe anymore. And they privatize those, the private and public timber stands of the Appalachians and the lakes of the Adirondacks. And by privatizing those things and stealing them, they made a profit for themselves. And when all of the federal environmental laws that were passed after Earth Day 1970, all of them were intended to restore free market capitalism in our country by forcing actors in the marketplace to pay the true cost of bringing their product to market. And what we do as river keepers, we have 172 river keepers, each one with a patrol boat, patrolling waterways and suing. We all sue polluters. And what we do, we don't even consider ourselves environmentalists anymore. We're free marketeers. We go out into the marketplace and we catch the cheaters, the polluters, and we say to them, we are going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because as long as somebody's cheating the free market, it distorts the whole marketplace, and none of us gets the advantages of the efficiency or the prosperity and the democracy that the free market otherwise promises our country. What we have to understand as Americans is there's a huge difference between free market capitalism, which makes the country more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism, which has been embraced in Capitol Hill, state capitals, etc., which is as antithetical to efficiency, prosperity, and democracy in America as it is in Nigeria. And there's nothing wrong with corporations. I own a corporation. Corporations, and I'm involved with a lot of others, they're good things. They drive our economy. They encourage people to assemble wealth and to risk it, and they create jobs, which is the whole point. but they should not be running our government. And the reason I just wrote the introduction for the republication of Barry Goldwater's 1955 classic, The Conscience of the Conservative, which is the Bible of American conservatism. And Goldwater says the same thing I said, which is, you know, it should be, and he says a lot of other stuff that conservatism used to, you know, mean about freedom and free markets, which no longer means, you know, he was a huge advocate of gay rights, you know, even back then, and a lot of other integration and all these other things that have fled conservatism. But he also said some nutty stuff too. But he said it's crazy to let corporations into the political process. It's an economic entity. They're acting for their own profit, and that's the problem. Is that we don't want them running our government because corporations don't want the same thing for America as Americans want. Corporations don't want democracy. They don't want free markets. They want profits. And the best way for them to get profits too often is to use our campaign finance system, which is just a system of legalized bribery, to get their hooks into a public official, then use that public official to dismantle the marketplace and give them monopoly control and a competitive edge, and then allow them to plunder the public commons, our treasury, our air, our water, etc., and turn it into cash for themselves. And it just becomes a corporate plutocracy if you allow them into the political process.